classes were without him. Elijah's thumb up, answering that it was much better without him. Sylvia looks toward Arthur's food and tries to get up, and her mouth starts watering as she stares at the food. Meanwhile, Charlotte extends her hand toward Sylvia while Elijah is eating. She says Arthur especially likes essential chain casting and mana utilization. Sylvia turns her eyes and looks toward Charlotte. Charlotte starts hissing, and she stops her hand there. Elijah says Arthur thought some of the mana utilization stuff felt repetitive after the things he told him. She is perfect when Elijah says Charlotte's in his chain casting class. He hears Charlotte smile and, putting her hand on her face, says please. He is making her blush. Elijah, while eating, asked Arthur how he was. He heard he had already beat up a professor. Looking down, Arthur responded that he had become the professor for that class. He hears Elijah spit on Arthur's face, wipes his mouth, and surprisingly asks, "Sorry, what? Is he going to be a professor?" Arthur angrily, looking toward him, wipes his face with his hand and answers yes. He replaces the professor who taught the class. So please don't go around spitting on a professor. Elijah abuses Arthur, saying that maybe he should ditch his class sometime and go to his. He wants to see him in action. Then he excitedly looked toward Arthur and asked Charlotte if he would head downtown for some shopping if he wanted to join them. Arthur surprisingly looks toward Elijah, and Charlotte adds that he should join them. Arthur responds that he is sorry but has 3 more classes after this. He needs to attend the upper division classes. Looking toward Charlotte excitedly, Elijah says it will just be him and her Charlotte. However, looking aside and scratching her face, Charlotte says she forgot she made plans today. Then she gets up from the chair, picks up her food, and tries a smile, saying, but they should go some other time, all 3 of them. They both sit there silently, looking toward her. Then she turned and stepped ahead, stopped and turned, looking toward them, and smiled, saying, well, see him later. Goodbye, Arthur. Arthur sits behind angrily and looks toward her. Then, with a sad face, Elijah says her other plans must be necessary. He guesses he will get some studying done in the library then. After this, Elijah looks toward Arthur and asks if she is nice, proper, and pretty. Does he think he has a shot with her? Looking toward Elijah, Arthur calls his name, heads down, and pats his back, saying he believes he can do better. Elijah, while chewing the food, surprisingly looks toward Arthur, and Sylvia sits at the table before them nods. After this, Arthur and Sylvia go to the ground side, and the students standing there look toward him and start murmuring. Arthur silently passes by the students with his hands in his pocket. Meanwhile, Claire and Curtis get there from behind. When Claire stands behind them, she says she didn't expect to see him in an upper division class. Arthur hears Arthur stop there and turn his head to look. Both of them raise their hands, asking him to come there. Arthur goes to them, and Claire looks toward Arthur, smiling, saying it's good to see him again. Then she grabs Arthur by his neck and looking toward him asks, let's not embarrass the disciplinary committee, all right? Arthur winks and smiles, answering that he will do his best while Sylvia goes to the lion, who sits on the ground. Meanwhile, Tesha and her team get there, and Arthur, looking toward them, asks if it is the whole class. Curtis stands ahead of them and answers there should be a few more. As Tesha and all the team members get there, Curtis, looking toward them, says they are there. Tesha's eyes fell on Arthur, who stood in the distance of her and was looking toward her, smiling. Tesha excitedly looks toward him while Claire grabs Arthur's neck and waves her hand, wishing Tesha good afternoon. Tesha stops there and looks toward Arthur's pout. Arthur looks toward her nervously, smiling, and she angrily turns and passes by them, answering pleasure. Arthur turns his eyes and looks toward Tesha. Tesha, with her team left, and Claire, looking toward them, says she is in a bad mood today. Arthur looked toward Claire, thinking it was because of her. Then Curtis points back and says Claire, they should also head over. He hears Arthur standing his back to them and sighing. Suddenly, Arthur's eyes glow, and he grips his hand angrily. He turns and looks toward Lucas, who has joined Tesha's team and passes by him smiling. However, Lucas Wykes is the most arrogant, deceitful, and treacherous. Arthur stands behind angrily and looks toward him, and Lucas also turns his eyes and, with hatred, looks toward Arthur. Suddenly, a hawk beast flapping in the sky lands on the ground, and the students stand their heads up and look toward the hawk beast coming down. The hawk beast flaps, and from that hawk, a lady taps, and all the students on the ground surround the hawk and the lady. Moreover, the lady stood beside her beast excitedly, looking toward the students and welcoming them. Then she said she was Professor Glory. She would be their instructor for a team fighting mechanics. Then she pointed toward the hawk and noted that this flare hawk was her bond torch. Arthur stood among the students, activating his power, and then looked toward her, let's see how strong she is. But as soon as Arthur tries to get information about her, she understands someone is using his magic to find out about her. She turns her head and looks at Arthur with shining eyes, while Arthur, looking toward her, winces. Furthermore, Arthur looks at her, thinking she hides her level and elemental attributes from many students. But why is she doing this? She stood before Arthur, who was staring at him, smiled and stepped toward him. She asked Arthur if it wasn't her newest colleague, Arthur Lewin. It's a pleasure to meet him. Then she says he is also the newly appointed professor for the practical mana manipulation class they all took during their underclassmen years. He hears the students standing behind Arthur, looking toward him, and starts gossiping. One of the boys asked the newest colleague what that meant. The girl standing beside him says no way that can be him, while the boy standing beside the girl says he heard a rumor that there is a new student professor. After this, Glory smiled, adding that while it's only an interim professor position, she would still say it's pretty impressive. Surprisingly, one student asks why she can't be a severe professor, and the other student, his friend, adds that this is even possible. Even some of the best upper-level students don't get to teach, yet this scrawny first year did. However, the student stood behind Arthur screaming, saying that it was not fair, and the girl with a surprised face said there must be a mistake. Curtis stood there smiling, telling them to settle down and stop being so jealous. Moreover, Arthur stood ahead, sighing, thinking if she put a target on his back on purpose. Professor Glory claps, adding now they should all have more faith in the director's decision. Arthur has proven himself to some degree by defeating the professor who taught the class previously. He hears the student standing behind Professor Glory with his friends raise his voice. Beating an underclassman professor means crap. Glory, while clapping, turns and looks toward that student. Then he adds most of them can win one, especially one that was just some thug adventurer. He hears the other students standing beside him answer yes. Professor Glory smiles, responding to quite the fire they all have. Then she asks why they don't test their strength against the new professor of practical mana manipulation today. While Arthur stood there, he scratched their ear with his little finger, and Tesha stood there in the distance and was looking toward him. After this, Arthur turns his eyes, looks toward the students who stand before him, and angrily looks toward him and reads their minds. The students in their minds were thinking they were going to kill this idiot. Who does this idiot think he is? Just kill him, and why is he getting all the attention? Arthur turned his eyes and looked toward Tesha, pointing to those students' smiles and asking her if she could believe this. Tesha is surprised and turns her head while Clave stands beside her, asking what's with that face. After this, Arthur, with a smiley face, says to Glory thanks her for the offer, but Director Goodsky asks him to take it easy on his upper division classes until he adjusts to school. This is his first day. After all, Professor Glory, putting a hand on his shoulder, looks into his eyes and smiles, answering, "Come on, that's no fun, now is it?" Then she gets near Arthur and, looking into his eyes, winks, saying he is a first year in an upper division class, and there's no special treatment there. He only needs to prove his qualifications through demonstration. It's only just and fair. Arthur smiles, and Professor Glory turns and looks toward the students, asking about a suitable class. They all raise their hands, while Arthur looks toward Glory, thinking just and fair is nothing. After this, Arthur asks Glory what she has in mind, Professor. She shows him her hand's first two fingers and answers she likes to begin the semester with a fun, casual game. Then she clenched her fist and laughed, asking what conquest. How about it? Kids and students started discussing while Arthur stood before her. Surprisingly, since when were war and conquest fun? However, Curtis raises his hand, adding that the professor has a suggestion. Then he asked about a mock team battle with one team's 3 disciplinary committee officers. Claire stood beside Curtis, adding that it would be a good opportunity for them to work on their teamwork. Professor Glory nodded, then folded her arms and smiled, answering that it was not a bad idea. Meanwhile, Clive stood beside Tesha and raised his hand, adding Professor Princess Tesha, and he could be their opponents on the other team. Tesha, looking toward him surprisingly, asks what Clive is. Here's Glory smile, responding. Now things are interesting. The disciplinary committee vs the students' council. But it would be unfair to have 2 against 3. Lucas raised his hand, adding he would volunteer to be on the student council team. Looking toward Lucas, Professor Glory responds to Mr. Wykes, their other genius freshman. She supposes it will be an excellent chance to assess his abilities well. After this, Arthur, Lucas, Claire, and Curtis step toward the professor, and she raises her hand and says the 6 of them gear up. As Arthur and Lucas stand beside each other, their shoulders bump, and Lucas angrily looks toward Arthur and says he is the commoner who stole his spot on the disciplinary committee. Arthur turned his eyes, looked toward him, and answered that it was not stealing if it was never his. However, Arthur stood alone aside, and at a distance to him, Claire and Curtis stood, while at their distance Tesha and Clive were, and at their back, Professor Glory was with her bond. While the students sit in the ground stadium and Sylvia sleeps on the stone, Claire helps Curtis put on his gloves. Lucas was wearing his gloves himself while Clive asked Tesha to help him wear elbow gear, but she winked and refused. On the other side, Arthur was wearing his elbow gear. Meanwhile, Tesla came to him and helped him to fasten the gear on his elbow. As she was tying his gear, he looked toward her and smiled, asking if Princess Tesha could be helping him like this. She tightened the gear, answering, "Please refrain from talking so loudly, Professor Lewin." Arthur shouted, then smiled, adding she didn't have to act so formal they couldn't hear them from over there. Tesha headed down, listened to him, and then looked toward him to answer. She hated having to act like she didn't know him. Arthur bluntly answered, then didn't, and she shouted at him. He meant he didn't care. Master Cynthia told her he wanted to keep a low profile, or so she thought. Arthur, pressing his cheek with his index finger, laughed, saying, "Well, he hasn't been doing an excellent job of that now, has he?" After this, Arthur asks if it's all right as long as a few things are still secret. Then he is okay with Sylvia's true identity, the level of her monocore, and whether she has noticed anything. Tesha answered she didn't know what. Then she said she couldn't sense his water as she was about to complete her sentence. Arthur gets close and puts his hand on her mouth, saying he keeps most of his abilities secret for now, so he would appreciate it if she did the same. Tesha folds her hand in front of him, and he gets close to her, but she doesn't have to ignore him, Tesha. While Tesha fearfully looks aside, she says he is too close. Meanwhile, Professor Glory gets there to raise her voice, and the two are fraternizing with the enemy. Then, showing them her 2 fingers, she says they will be starting in 2 minutes. Tesai pushed Arthur backwards while he was lovingly looking toward her. Then Tesha turned, and Arthur stood behind her and called her name. She turned to look, and he, lovingly looking at her, says let's both do their best. He wants to see how much she has improved. Tesha, with a smiley face, answered he would better watch out then. After this, Tesai, Clive, and Lucas stand at one side, and before them, on the other side, Arthur, Claire, and Curtis. At the same time, Professor Glory stood between them with her bond. Then she looks at both sides and says, "Before they begin, there are the rules. The match will have a time limit of 30 minutes, after which they will have a short discussion and analysis of what plays out." Further, she says Team DC will have a handicap since Curtis and Claire have had more classical training than Team SC with 2 first years, and that handicap is Arthur Lewin, who will be king. Knock him out, and the whole team loses, and artificers specially design the gear they use to measure the damage dealt. Moreover, she says if the amount of damage passes the threshold encrypted, it will release a shrill noise. Anyone who chooses to ignore this warning, continue fighting, and cast spells will be immediately banned from her class. She hears Lucas smile, then she adds she may be up for expulsion and lets her be clear this equipment will not protect them. They should be advanced enough to protect themselves with mana, but can be injured while wearing it. Remember it. Then she raises her hand, saying now let the battle commence. However, they all activate their powers and Claire, holding her flame sword, runs toward Clive. Clive, also having his weapon, runs toward her. On the other side, Curtis, holding his sword and sitting on his lion, runs after Tesha while she creates her magic and runs ahead. While running, she turns and looks toward Curtis. Arthur stood beside, looking toward Tesai, and Curtis thought Curtis probably wouldn't be able to beat Tesha, but he should be able to hold her off long enough. Then he turned his eyes and looked toward Lucas, who was stepping toward him, activating his magic and removing his wand from his dimension ring. Lucas, stepping toward Arthur, smiles, and Arthur activates his power and pulls out his transparent sword from his dimension ring. While thinking, he thought he might have gotten a bit more humble since coming to Xyrus, but he guesses not. Arthur's eyes start to glow, and he, using his spell, looks toward Lucas and smiles. Arthur, activating his wind magic, stepped toward Lucas as they stood before each other. Looking toward him, Lucas asks what's taking him so long, scared his reputation might crumble after losing today. Arthur glanced up there, Professor Glory, with her bond in the air to watch that fight. Looking toward her, Arthur turned his head and closed his eyes, thinking they wanted a show. Arthur activates his power, and the dark purple aura emerges from his body. Lucas surprisingly looks toward Arthur, while Professor Glory stood on her bond, looked down at Arthur, and smiled. On the other hand, Claire turns her eyes, and Clive surprisingly looks toward Arthur. Also, Prince Curtis surprisingly looks toward Arthur while Tessai sighs. Arthur's wind magic layer surrounds him, and he steps ahead and crunches the ground, then dashes toward Lucas. Lucas, gritting his teeth, releases the fire from her wand, saying manifest and burn, obeying his command and enclosing those who stand before him. Lucas, with his flame magic, creates the Inferno's cage around him, while Arthur whirls his wind magic toward Lucas, but before his wind magic attacks Lucas's fire explosion attacks him, and he, holding his sword, falls backwards in the air, but before he loses his wind magic and cuts the flame. As Lucas's fire spread over there, it was difficult for Arthur to attack him. As the firestorm crashed the stones there while Arthur was breaking his sword, he stepped on the stone and cracked it. Also, the fire explosion occurred near Arthur. He moves backward, bends his finger on the ground, and sits up on the ground. He tries to cross that fire, but Lucas has created the Inferno's cage all around him, making it difficult for Arthur to get near him. Arthur sits there, surprisingly looking toward the flame balls that Lucas released from his wand, which spread all around there. Arthur got up and stood beside the crash stone. Suddenly, the flame balls that Lucas was releasing upward started to combine. However, Lucas, with his flame magic, makes a barrier shield around him and sees Arthur grit his teeth while Lucas laughs, asking flame balls to fall. Those flame balls move toward Arthur and explode while Arthur runs away, but there are many fireballs, and they surround Arthur. However, heat spreads around Arthur, and due to this heat, he starts to sweat. Then he stomped on the stone and dashed aside. As he jumped, the flame balls exploded, and the flame explosion occurred there. Arthur hardly saved himself from that explosion. He, using his wind magic, slashed his sword to cut the flame bullets that were moving toward Arthur. Lucas laughs, saying that's it, dance for him. The flame bullets quickly move toward Arthur from behind. Meanwhile, Sylvia worriedly asks him if Papa is okay. Looking behind the flame bullets coming toward him, Arthur answers he is fine. Sylvia then asks how everyone else is doing. She laughs, answering Mama, who is winning against Curtis, and Claire, who is winning against the grumpy guy. Arthur stomps on the ground, responding, got it. As the fire bullets were about to hit him, but before the bullets hit him, he slashed the sword, cut the stone, and threw the stone toward the bullets. The flame bullets explode in the air, and Arthur jumps, asking Sylvia to tell him if something unusual happens. The flame storm moves toward Arthur while he slashes his wind magic sword run, and while running away, he notices Lucas, who stands in Inferno's cage barrier, and think that Kid's monopool is even more significant than when he was an adventurer. Arthur steps on the stone and dashes ahead while the stone on which he steps is cracked. Arthur runs away and moves toward Lucas, while the flame explosion occurred behind him and the flame storm was coming after Arthur. Lucas stood in Inferno's cage barrier, holding his wand and laughing. The fire explosion occurs before Arthur, and he falls backward, flying in the air. While flying in the air, he thinks that without fire and water attributes and mana, he can't do anything against this heat, and his mana pool won't be able to keep up with his. The flame bullets move toward Arthur, and while moving toward him, the flame explodes due to the explosion. The ground cracks, and the stone falls away. Arthur rolls, jumps backward, and saves himself from that explosion while Lucas stands there, saying he is glad he didn't join the disciplinary committee. He might have quit school if he had been on the same team as someone as incompetent. Arthur, creating his wind magic, jumps on the stone and flies in the air on the stone, passing by the heat, thinking he can't conjure a wind spell large enough to go up against it. Arthur stood in the heat, creating the wind magic. Meanwhile, the flames scratched his arm. Arthur slashed his wind magic with his hand and, gritting his teeth in pain, threw the flame away. After this, he kicks the stone into the flame ball. The stone bumps into the flame and cracks it into pieces. Arthur, looking toward the fire around him, thinks now he has to think and focus on the fire. Wind magic pushes, pulls, and manipulates air to achieve desired effects. But what if he was to manipulate the air particles themselves? He could eliminate the very thing that fire needs to keep burning oxygen. As he was thinking this, the flame bullets moved toward him, and Arthur, with his wind magic, crashed the flame. Arthur, profusely sweating due to heat, looks toward Lucas, who stands in Inferno's cage. The barrier is releasing flame with his wand. Lucas, looking toward Arthur, laughs, asking how he beat that sorry excuse of a professor by running. Asking this, Lucas released the flame from his wand toward Arthur. The flame bam on the ground cracked, and Arthur flew in the air and moved backward. Arthur screeches on the ground thinking, but could he manipulate it fast enough to extinguish the fire before it hits him? Better yet, would he even be able to breathe thinking this all? Arthur chuckles and then thinks, why is he feeling so hard? Then Arthur, while sweating and holding his wind sword, smiles, thinking this is why he came to school. Professor Glory sat on her bed, looking down and thought, well, now Lucas is better than she had heard. Also, her eyes are shining due to the heat surrounding the ground. Then she looked toward Arthur, and Lucas stood in the heat barrier and thought Inferno's cage was one of the stricter flame attribute domain spells. Yet he can use it so proficiently at such a young age. On top of that, his mana reserves almost rival that of a silver core mage. After this, she sighed, thinking the world was changing, and then she winked and patted her bond, saying oldies like them wouldn't have a place soon. Then, looking toward Arthur, she thinks, especially if they see more kids like Arthur Lewin. Furthermore, she thinks he lacks variation in his spells for a dual elemental mage, but makes up for it with fluid movements and tight control. He was only mildly curious about the kid who could beat a veteran adventurer, even one as careless as Geist. Then she looked toward Arthur, who, using his wind magic, passed through the flame bullets. Arthur graduated on the ground and slashed his wind sword while the flame bullets were moving toward him, and he moved toward Lucas and cut those flames with his sword. After this, he stood on the ground, and his wind magic surrounded him. Also, a green aura came out of his body. Looking toward Arthur, Professor Glory thinks, but that pressure, what sort of life did he live to be capable of that at his age? Arthur stabs his transparent sword on the ground and slightly bends, then gets up and holds his breath while his wind magic surrounds him. Arthur held his breath step ahead, and the green aura from his body was moving upward. Professor Glory looks toward him, surprisingly thinking, what's he doing? Now he is holding his breath. As Arthur was stepping ahead, the flame bullet moved toward him from behind. Those bullets hit Arthur's backside, but he gritted his teeth in pain, keep stepping ahead. See this? Glory thinks his uniform will go off if he is surprised to see when the flame bullet comes to Arthur, but he doesn't get near him. The flame sword moves around Arthur and doesn't hurt him, and Arthur, surrounding himself with the wind magic, continues stepping ahead toward Lucas. Professor Glory gets surprised and then pats her bond, asking him to lower her pat while flying in the air move downward. Glory looked toward Arthur, thinking the little monster was unlike wind magic. Trying to manipulate the air involves much more insight, higher concentration levels, and chanting to properly spellcast. Furthermore, she sits on her bond and thinks it's why there aren't mages capable of just sucking the air out of their opponent's lungs. It would take hours of concentration to manipulate the air directly inside a moving, living target. That's why mages use their own body as the source or a pre-designated, unmovable location. He keeps his area of effect as close to his body as possible, but even then, he can do this in the middle of a fight. Arthur was moving toward Lucas while Lucas stood in Inferno's cage barrier, sending flame bullets toward him. However, Arthur stepped toward him, manipulating a thin layer of air around his body to form a vacuum and disperse the fire before it hit him. It sure sounded a lot easier in his head. At this rate, his uniform will reach its threshold before getting the hang of it, but if he can, he will get through that barrier. Lucas sends his flame bullets toward him, but his flame magic does not affect Arthur. He sees Lucas gritting his teeth, thinking how he can block his spells like that. He doesn't see any wind magic being used, but it doesn't matter. He will end it now. Lucas raises his voice, raises his protector, and with his flame magic, he creates the Flame Guardian and points it toward Arthur. Arthur looks toward him and smiles, and the Flame Guardian thumps on the ground and runs toward Arthur. However, Arthur slashes his sword, so he finally reaches his limit. Suddenly, something booms behind him. Arthur stood there worriedly and turned his head, thinking about that sudden mana surge. Meanwhile, Sylvia calls him as Arthur turns his head to look. Meanwhile, the Flame Guardian starts circulating him. Arthur, slashing his sword, turns his eyes and looks around toward the Flame Guardian. The Flame Guardian runs toward Arthur and punches him while Arthur skids backward, creating his wind magic. Suddenly, his eyes fall on Professor Glory, who, on her bond, extends her hand ahead, shouts, calls Tesha, and passes outside the Inferno's cage barrier. Looking toward her, Arthur grits his teeth while the Flame Guardian runs toward him. The Flame Guardian ran toward him to punch him while Arthur silently stood there, head down, as the Flame Guardian was about to punch him. Arthur activates his static void magic, and due to his magic, the Flame Guardian disappears. Arthur was injured, and he stepped ahead and stumbled while Professor Glory, outside the barrier, raised her voice and held it together. Arthur, they needed to get out of there quickly and reach Tessai. Arthur glances aside toward the cracked ground, then turns and runs ahead, thinking he has to work fast. He has already used most of his mana reserves, trying to learn that stupid vacuum barrier spell. Also, Professor Glory, on her bond, was following him. Arthur, while running and squeezing his eyes, thinks that Curtis released his beast will from the mana spike he had felt earlier. Then he turns and surprisingly looks toward Tesha, who lies in Curtis's beast, which will spell unconscious. Looking toward her, Arthur thinks, why doesn't she have any protective barrier around her? Arthur thumps, then he stumbles, and with a puffy breath, feels that it's not essential. As Curtis's beast will spell was about to attack Tesha, Arthur ran toward her, thinking he didn't have enough mana to block this, so he grabbed Tesha. He hugged her while the beast attack was moving toward him. Arthur covered her with his body, thinking this was going to hurt. After some time, both Tesha and Curtis were fighting, and Tesha stood in the distance looking toward Inferno's cage barrier, thinking she wondered if Arthur was doing okay. Even if it's him, winning will be complicated while only using his two weakest elements. As she stood there, we thought about this all while Curtis ran toward her, holding his flame sword. He swung his sword, Tesha put his sword before her, and his sword clanged with hers. Curtis, holding his sword, pushes Tesha's sword and, looking toward her, says it is bad manners to look away from her opponent in the middle of a battle, Princess Tesha. Tesha silently looks toward him. He pushes his sword and strikes it to attack, but Tesha twirls and his sword passes by her. After this, Tesha moved and knocked her sword, and her sword clanged with his flame sword. Also, auras emerged from both of their bodies. Princess Tesha created her wind magic and swung her sword, but Curtis put his flame shield before him, and her sword clanged with the shield. Tesha, looking toward him, says her apologies to Prince Curtis. Suddenly, she feels something throb, and she creates her wind magic attack on Curtis. He flies in the air backward and is about to thud on the ground. Before he thuds on the ground, his bond jumps and catches him. He held his flame sword and shield thud on his bond. While Curtis stood there holding her sword and activating her wind magic, she put her hand on her stomach because she felt pain in her mana core. She gritted her teeth, thinking, what was that? What's wrong with her? Meanwhile, Curtis is sitting on his bond, hopping there. He raises his hand, and a voice asks Grotter, let's go. Also, Grotter had activated his power. His tail was moving, and his eyes were glowing. Curtis himself started changing into the lion. His face, teeth, and hair were changed, and he raised his voice just like they had practiced. Tesha stood there gritting her teeth, thinking about the ambient mana they were gathering. It looks like they are preparing for a significant spell. Tesha creates her spell, and the aura starts emerging from her hand, and with her magic, the roots start breaking from the ground. However, she lifted her magic hand, and with her magic, the root snare spurts out of the ground and spreads there. While Curtis sits on his bond, he moves toward her. His bond crosses all the roots of snare, which were spread there around them. Tesha, using her magic, creates the arrow missile and moves it toward them while making her magic with her wand. Putting her hand on her stomach, she thinks something is wrong with her core. She is not correctly assimilating to the Elder Wood Guardian's core. Maybe she should forfeit. Then she grits her teeth and thinks no. Then, looking toward her wand, she believes she is the student council president. She can't have anyone thinking that she is weak, much less a coward. However, she stood up on her root snare, created the wind magic, and combined her root and wind magic, thinking she could win. On the other side, Curtis's bonds grip the ground, and Curtis creates his world's howl, raises his voice, "Let's go, Grotter." Curtis makes his flame magic and throws his flame storm toward the ground, and due to his magic, the stones on the ground start flying up. After this, the stone mixes up with the flame storm, and Curtis, using his magic, moves his flame storm magic toward Tesha, who stands up on her root snare holding her magic wand. Moreover, Tesha's magic binds her core inside her stomach, and she thinks she is about to fall. She puts a hand on her stomach and falls on her root snare, and with her half-opened eyes, she sees the flame explosion coming toward her. As her eyes were closed, she felt someone beside her. However, the flame explosion occurs there, and Glory, on her bond flying in the air, moves toward Tesha, shouting no. Then she jumped from her bond and thudded on the ground, and due to that flame explosion, the smoke spread there. As the smoke ended, Glory looked around there. Tesha's root snare was burning, and she thought there. Meanwhile, her eyes fell on Arthur, who was injured, lying on the ground on Tesha, and his uniform was burned due to the flame. Meanwhile, the doctors holding their aid boxes run toward them, and Glory, looking toward the doctors, wonders how Arthur got there. With a sad face, Curtis came to Glory, saying, "Professor, he didn't mean to. He didn't know she would faint." Glory sits beside Arthur and raises her hand, responding, "It's all right, she knows." Then Glory turned her head, looked toward the student beside the doctor named Dagal, and asked him to get the rest of the team on standby. Then she looked toward the doctor named Pawn and asked him to start the damage assessment now. Both nod their heads, and then she turns her head and looks toward Arthur, who lies on the ground grabbing Tessai while Tesha is unconscious, lying under him. Looking toward them, Glory thinks, what the hell just happened? After some time, Arthur was admitted to the hospital. His face, body, and head were bandaged, and he, with his half-opened eyes, saw Sylvia sitting on him and looking toward him. He looked toward Sylvia, asking what while she had a sad face, sighed and hit Arthur's face with her hand, saying Papa is an idiot. Arthur, in pain, grits his teeth and closes his eyes. Then she looks toward him with teary eyes and says he thinks he is so strong, but he keeps almost dying. What does Sylvia do without Papa Arthur holding his head, looking toward Sylvia, then looking toward her and calling her name? Then he sighed and smiled, saying he was sorry and she was right. He has been a little reckless. After this, Arthur holds Sylvia's head and gets her close to him. Then he puts his head together with her and closes his eyes, saying don't worry, he won't ever leave her. Sylvia, with teary eyes, looks toward Arthur. Then he pats her head, and she closes her eyes, asking him to promise. Meanwhile, the door knocks, and Arthur asks to come in. President Goodsky opens the door, and looking toward Arthur, says she didn't expect a reply but sees he is awake already. Then, standing at the door, she asks him how he feels. Arthur answers, a little concerned that he is seeing the director of his school so often. Then she comes to him and sits on the chair beside the bed. Looking toward him, she says if he has the will to be so cheeky, she is sure he will be okay. Arthur asks how's Tisha, and Goodsky answers, well, the good news is that Tesha is in a much better state than him. Then, looking aside, she asks for now, it's the beast will right, her body can't handle it. Arthur responded yes, and she turned her head and, surprisingly, looked toward him and asked how he knew that. Arthur tries to get up, answering because he is the one who gave her that beast will, but before he gets up, he again thuds on the bed. Adding, he should be the one to help her with the assimilation, but he doesn't think he can in this state as Arthur thuds Sylvia with a sad face and moves toward him. Goodsky responds no, he has done more than enough. This is her fault. She kept the knowledge of Tesha's beast will a secret. Furthermore, she says she is at the stage of the assimilation process where she is most vulnerable. This might have been avoided if she had at least told Professor Glory. After this, Goodsky, putting their hand on Arthur's hand, says he thanks him for sacrificing himself to save her disciple. Arthur surprisingly looks at her, responding that she makes it sound like he is dying. He hears her chuckle, and then she gets up. She steps toward the exit door, saying she has contacted the royal family and his own. They should be there soon, so he should get some rest until then. Arthur thumbs up and smiles, responding all right, thanks her director. Then she left the room and clicked the door. Standing outside the room, she asked if she was sure she didn't want to go in. Tesha stood beside the wall, turning her head, answering not yet. She didn't think she could, and besides, he should rest. Goodsky taps her hand on Tesha's shoulder and asks, then Tesha surprisingly looks toward Goodsky's hand on her shoulder. Goodsky grabs her by her shoulder and points aside with a wink, adding that she lets them feast on those delicious-looking desserts brought in earlier while she works up the courage. Tesha doesn't want to go, and she, with a surprised face, nods. Stepping ahead, she turns her head and, with a sad face, looks toward the room door where Arthur was admitted. Arthur is asleep, covered in bandages. He slowly opens his eyes and sees his family in front of him. They are concerned about Arthur's health. His mother asks how he is feeling while caressing his head. Arthur replies that he is much better, and he apologizes for always worrying them like this. Ellie tells Arthur that he looks worse than ever. Arthur thanks her for her kind and heartfelt words, and he calls her a foul-mouthed thug of a sister. Ellie sticks out her tongue, and Arthur smiles. His father tells Arthur that she sounds like this now, but his sister cries even more than his mother. Ellie is embarrassed to hear that, and she yells at her father, saying that he promised not to tell Arthur about it. Arthur's mother asks how he, of all people, got hurt so badly like this on the first day of school. Reynolds says that it looks like their son is already getting into fights at school. Arthur starts grinning and says they should see what the other guy looks like. His father and sister start laughing while his mother is scared to think about the other child. She wonders what has Arthur done, and whose poor child did he obliterate. She thinks they will have to move and live underground with the dwarves. She can help out by healing miners, but she's worried about Ellie. Director Cynthia tells Mrs. Lewin that he is only joking. They turn around and see that Director Cynthia and Tesha are there with her family. They brought Arthur fruits and some flowers. Arthur's parents are shocked to see them. They bow down and say that it's an honor to meet the Majesties in person. Tess's father says the honor is his because they are finally able to meet the parents of the one who saved their child not once but twice now. Tess's mother holds Mrs. Lewin's hands and says that their meeting has been far overdue. Alduin introduces Reynolds to his father and says that he is the former king of Elenoir, Virion, and then he introduces Tesha, his daughter. Tesha starts blushing and says that it is an honor to meet them all. Arthur's parents look at each other, then they glance at Arthur and start smiling. Arthur is embarrassed and wonders what they are thinking right now. Alice holds Tessa's hands and says that she is so glad to meet her. She tells her that Arthur has told them so much about her. Tess starts smiling and asks if that is true. Arthur's mother starts smiling and says of course, and it's such a comfort knowing that he has someone as responsible as her by his side. She whispers in Tess's ear to take care of him in the future as well. Tess starts blushing after hearing that. Virion pulls a chair near Arthur and asks how he's feeling. Arthur says that he is a little worried about what they are scheming. Virion tells Arthur to relax, but the worst thing that can happen is that he becomes his grandson-in-law. Tesha pulls his beard and tells her grandpa to stop talking nonsense. Tess starts blushing and tells Arthur that she is sorry for all this. She sits on a chair and says that she told all of them not to come, but they wouldn't listen, even though it's all her fault that he ended up here in the first place. Arthur starts smiling and tells her that it is fine. In fact, he likes how lively it is. Ellie looks at Tess and says she is the girl her brother risked his life to save. Tess starts smiling and asks if she's his sister. Tess tells Ellie that she's even prettier than she thought. Ellie looks away and says that she is not bad herself. Arthur tells Ellie that she's the one that gave her that bow for her birthday. Ellie is surprised to hear that, and she thanks Tess for that. Tess starts smiling and says that she is welcome. Suddenly, Ellie asks Arthur who is prettier between them. Arthur replies that they are both pretty ugly to him. Tess and Ellie are annoyed to hear that. Arthur asks Virion if he got a chance to take a look at Tess's mana core. Virion replies that luckily, her body seems more compatible with the beast core than his when he first integrated. Virion asks Arthur how did he manage to pick up an Elderwood Guardian's beast core. Arthur says by killing one. Virion looks at him suspiciously as Arthur starts smiling. Cynthia tells everyone that she hates to disrupt such an amiable setting, but Tesha's assimilation must be monitored once more. She opens the door and says that there are quite a few other visitors stuck outside due to the maximum capacity of this room. Outside the door, there are other visitors gathered to meet Arthur. Arthur remembers that after his family left with Tesha and her family, he continued to have more visitors throughout the day. Some came wanting answers for what exactly happened, while others came out of pure concern for his health. Gideon is trying to give Arthur medicine, but he's scared to try. Gideon leaves after a while and tells Arthur that he should stop by his personal training room after he recovers. Arthur asks how does he know about that. Gideon replies that Director Goodsky called him and asked him to build some training artifacts for him. Gideon tells Arthur that he owes him now and leaves. Arthur is shocked to hear that, and he tells him to close the door. Arthur is about to sleep, but someone else enters the room. Arthur asks what does he want now, but he's surprised to see Tess standing there. Arthur starts smiling and asks if she finished her assimilation session already. Tess says that she is still recovering, so Master Goodsky wanted her to stop early. Arthur says that's probably for the best and asks how's her core feeling and if she has another episode of pain like before. Tess starts smiling. Arthur asks what's so funny, and Tess replies that he almost died and he is still worrying about her. Tess says it was the same back then when he saved her from the bandits. Arthur tries to get up, but he starts feeling pain again. Tess asks if he is okay. Arthur says that it is still hard for him to move, but he will be alright soon. Tess says that she knows he will, but let her apologize. Arthur starts smiling and says he told her not to apologize for saving her again. Tess says that she is not apologizing for that, but for taking advantage of him like this. Tess starts kissing Arthur. The sweeper is cleaning the floor outside the room. Tess comes running outside and starts panting near a window. Her face has turned red. Tess thinks that she kissed Arthur, and that was her first kiss. She wonders if she did it right. Tess looks at her reflection in the window and tries mimicking the kiss. She places her head against the wall and sits down on the ground. She says that she probably came on too strong, and Arthur is going to think that she's lewd. Tess wonders if she should go back to his room and pretend it was all a joke. She slaps her face and says she can't think like that. Tess thinks that she did the right thing because things would never progress if she left it up to Arthur. She gets up and thinks that he still treats her like a child every time they are around, and besides, who cares if he doesn't like her back? It will be his loss. Tess tells herself that she's a talented mage, smart and popular too, and not to be conceited. But she's not bad looking either, so it will be Arthur's loss. Tess starts walking towards her room. Sylvie jumps on Arthur's bed and sees that he is in shock. Arthur thinks that he kissed Tesha Iralith, a 13-year-old girl. He wonders if he is a criminal now. He shakes his head and says that he is not because he is in the body of a 12-year-old boy. And in this world, there are plenty of children their age who are getting ready to marry. Arthur smiles and thinks that she is the one who kissed him. He slaps himself and thinks that he is so stupid. He rests his head on the pillow and places his arm on his eyes. He asks Arthur what he's doing. After some time, some students are talking about the new professor who is only a first year. A student says that he heard that he got the spot by beating the professor. Another one asks if he beats the first year, then would he get to be a professor too? Director Goodsky is taking a lift with Arthur and Gideon. She tells Arthur that she heard tomorrow will be his first day of teaching, and if he has enough time to prepare some material. Arthur says considering he just got discharged from the hospital yesterday, probably not, but he'll be able to work things out. Arthur looks at a student practicing inside a room and asks how Tess is doing with her assimilation. Director Goodsky tells him that he can always see her if he is that worried about her. Arthur remembers that he ignored Tess completely the last time and says sure. She tells Arthur that Tesha's assimilation with her grandfather Virion has been going smoothly, but he has to go back to Elenoir soon. They reach outside a door, and Arthur asks if she's going to take over for Virion. Gideon tells them to get the show on the road. Director Goodsky tells Gideon that she didn't think he would be so enthusiastic about this, considering how much he complained about wasting his valuable free time. Gideon replies that he made it a bit of a game to try and dumbfounded this cheeky little brat, thinking this will just about do it. She says that she merely asked for some sturdy artifacts to serve as a training aid for Arthur. Gideon starts grinning as he opens the door and says that he did a lot more than that. Inside the room, there is a fountain and some greenery. There's also a robot with 4 arms. Arthur enters the room and says that it is impressive. Gideon yells at him to look at his artifact, not the room. Director Goodsky says there seems to be quite a bit of mana fluctuations radiating from this. She asks Gideon what that thing is. Gideon says it is kind of her to ask. He tells her that this is the latest and greatest edition of his training operator and blast inductor. It is capable of adjusting its runes and mana barrier output to withstand spells from initiate and even mid-tier silver mages, and it is called Tobai. Gideon starts cleaning Tobai with his sleeves and says that he has currently set its base specs to level 5, which translates roughly to that of a dark orange core mana beast. Arthur takes off his bracelet and asks if that dummy is about as strong as a yellow core human being. Gideon tells Arthur that Tobai has a solid malagorite iron body, so while the attacks that he'll produce are on that level, his overall durability is even higher. Arthur instantly punches and pierces Tobai's chest. Tobai falls on the ground. Arthur tells Gideon that it looks like they are going to have to raise Tobai's level. Gideon is shocked to see that. Meanwhile, there are a lot of dead monsters inside a dungeon. A soldier steps on the dead body of the monster and asks if they have seen wraith skulls like these before. Another one says they usually don't get this big or this silky gray in color. Lance Baron asks his subordinate if he is certain that no humans, elves, or dwarves have set foot in this dungeon. He replies, yes, Lance Baron. The only entrance down here had long been closed off, according to the specialists. Baron looks at a piece of torn banner and says this just got much more serious then. Meanwhile, Arthur is training with the robots inside the training room. Arthur swings his sword, but Tobai blocks the attack and rushes to punch Arthur. Arthur ducks, grabs it by the arm, and smashes it to the ground. Arthur snaps its arm off. Gideon loses the bet to Director Goodsky. Arthur feels a little pain in his shoulder. Gideon asks if he is actually hurt or if he's conspiring with Director Goodsky. Arthur tells him to give him a break. He asks if he saw his sloppy footwork out there. Gideon apologizes and says that he thought he was dancing out there for the King of Sapin. Gideon brings out his diary and asks if he has any feedback this time. Arthur tells him that Tobai's joints are a pretty bad weak spot, so they should work on reinforcing those also. Even if they can't conjure spells, for a mage, it's a bit limiting that they can't fire any offensive elemental magic. Gideon says he assumed Tobai would be sparring against an augmenter, not the devil incarnate. Arthur says that he thinks Tobai's mana reinforcement can use some work. Gideon is surprised to hear that. Arthur says right now, Tobai is emitting a layer of protective mana around its body. Even though it's the fastest and easiest way for a mage to protect themselves, it's also weak to attacks targeting the same place. It might be a bit more complicated and extensive. But it would be better if Tobai could conjure an array of individual plates of mana interconnected with each other. That way, once the initial barrier is set up, it'll be easier for Tobai to mend its barrier more quickly when it breaks, and without having to waste drawing excessive amounts of mana from its crystal to conjure up a completely new barrier. Arthur cleans the sweat from his face using a towel, and is surprised to see everyone looking at him with disbelief. Director Goodsky asks Arthur if he can conjure a mana barrier like that. Arthur nods in approval. She says it's intriguing. While the initial cast of applying that sort of mana barrier might take longer, it would still offer much more flexibility than the traditional mana shroud that mages use these days. Goodsky says she must relay this to the Mages Guild and see what they have to say. She thanks Arthur and leaves. Gideon is examining Arthur closely. Arthur asks what he's doing. Gideon says that he is checking to see what other gold he has stashed in there. In the morning, Arthur is slowly walking towards the class using his sword as a cane. He thinks that maybe he shouldn't have gone up against 2 level 7 Tabas when he hasn't fully healed. Arthur slips and is about to fall, but he grabs someone's shoulder and avoids falling. Arthur is surprised to see Kathleen put his arm around her shoulder. Meanwhile, the students are talking about the new professor in the class. One of them says he personally wants to see the first year try to teach, and another student says it'll be pretty funny watching him stutter and pretend like he knows what he's doing. Another student says he has gotten tutored by a 5th year, so he'll ask some questions that the first year wouldn't even know how to answer. One student says that his father donates over several thousand golds a year to this school, and they're using first years as teachers. It's embarrassing. Another student says that he snuck out his dad's precious image recording artifact, so he can show his dad what they're doing with his money. The door opens, and Arthur enters the room with his arm around Kathleen. The students are surprised to see that. Arthur wonders why are they making such a big fuss. He suddenly realizes that Kathleen was a princess. He tells Kathleen that he will be okay on his own now. Kathleen goes to sit down on a desk while Arthur takes the stage and introduces himself. He tells the students that his name is Arthur Lewin, and he's a disciplinary committee member and the son of 2 wonderful mages and a doting bother and their new professor. The students start shouting at Arthur to get out of here because they don't want to waste their time learning from a first year. Arthur thinks that at least they are energetic, and he thinks that this all could have been avoided if Director Goodsky or another professor had come with him. A student jumps in front of Arthur. Arthur asks what he thinks he is doing, and the student replies that he just suddenly feels like he wants to be a professor now, and all he has to do is pummel the instructor to the ground. Everyone starts cheering for the student to beat Arthur. He tells them that it will not take long. Arthur starts releasing his aura and tells the student to sit, but he gets scared and falls to the ground. Arthur tells the students that Director Goodsky did not bother giving him any official documents, but, like it or not, he will be teaching this class. If anyone has a problem, then feel free to leave, and he'll even allow them to be placed into another class of their choice. However, if any of them are even a tiny bit curious as to how this little boy with a limp got to become a professor at the most prestigious magic academy in Dicathan, then he encourages them to stay and learn. Arthur asks the student if he's going to stay there on the ground. He tells him to either leave or go back to his seat. He gets up and apologizes to Arthur and quickly goes to his seat. Everyone starts sweating, and there is a pin-drop silence in the class. Arthur thinks that it looks like they have a full class today. Arthur turns around and says that since this is a practical mana manipulation class, he will ask a practical question. Arthur asks what the best way to utilize mana from the surrounding atmosphere is. A student tells Arthur that mana is best utilized by absorbing the mana formed in the atmosphere into the mana core, where it can be condensed and purified for use when spells or techniques are cast. Arthur smiles and says that is good. He tells them that, as they all know, the difference between augmenters and conjurers lies in the fact that augmenters mostly use the mana in their cores via their mana channels. Conjurers, meanwhile, utilize the mana directly from the surrounding atmosphere via their mana veins. Arthur asks why both types of mages have to meditate and absorb mana if only the augmenters primarily utilize the mana they absorb into their core. The same student with a ponytail raises their hands and says that is because, while conjurers rarely incorporate mana into physical attacks, they still need to use their own mana to manipulate the mana in the atmosphere in order to form the spell. Arthur says that is right. What conjurers are doing is essentially using their own mana that they've coded with a specific spell so that the ambient mana knows how to behave. That being said, if conjurers inherently use less mana in their spells than augmenters do, he asks if the color of a mage's mana core a truly accurate way of measuring their level. Arthur tells everyone that he is going to need 6 volunteers who have elemental affinities to come down to the stage and line up. He wants conjurers to his left and augmenters to his right. 6 students arrive in front of Arthur. He tells them that for this exercise, he wants everyone to initiate the most basic spell of their affinity, and conjurers can't use a wand. The students did exactly that and used their spells to conjure fire, air, water, and earth. Arthur tells augmenters to launch their spells, and he tells conjurers to absorb the spell back into their hands. Everyone is shocked to hear that as Arthur starts smiling. Everyone starts to do it according to Arthur's instructions, but they failed. Arthur looks at Kathleen and thinks that she's close to getting it. A student says this is stupid and asks Arthur what's the point of absorbing back a spell they already prepared and conjured. Another student has rocks attached to his head. He says they all know only high-level augmenters can cast long-distance spells. Arthur uses a long-distance wind magic spell. A student asks if they are supposed to be impressed by that, when most augmenters can do that once they reach orange stage. Arthur says it's true that it's not hard. He uses the same attack again with increased intensity, and there's a large crack in the wall. Arthur asks if they have seen any augmenters do that at the orange stage. Everyone is surprised to see that. Arthur says that he can't accurately demonstrate what happens when conjurers are able to absorb spells they invoke, but trust him, it will only help them. Arthur sits on the floor and says those who want to try, they should come down. After the class is over, Sylvie is resting on Arthur's head. He asks Sylvie how did he do in the class. Sylvie tells him that she doesn't know she was sleeping. Arthur sits on the bench outside and says that this is the good thing about being a professor. He can end class as early as he wants. Sylvie tries to catch a butterfly, but she falls down and Arthur starts laughing. Kathleen arrives there and asks Arthur if this seat is taken, and he replies yes, it's. Kathleen is annoyed to hear that. Arthur says that he is kidding. Kathleen sits beside Arthur. Arthur thinks that he can never tell what this girl is thinking. She tells Arthur that it was a good lesson. Arthur thanks her, and there's an awkward silence between the two. Arthur wonders if that is all she has to say. Kathleen suddenly turns her head towards Arthur. He gets startled, but Kathleen tells Arthur that there's something she has been meaning to tell him for a while now. Arthur wonders if Kathleen is going to profess her love for him, too, and he ultimately succumbs to Arthur Lewin's unique and acquired taste. He wonders if he will be the cause of a civil war between the two races. Kathleen bows her head and says, please accept her deepest apology on behalf of her family for what happened with Sebastian at the auction house, for how her father behaved afterward, and for her brother's blunder both in the alleyway and now. Kathleen looks up and sees that Arthur is pulling his cheeks. She asks what he's doing. He tells her that he is humbling himself. Arthur says that he is surprised that she is still bothered by things that happened over 4 years ago. Kathleen says while she had always looked up to her father, in many ways, he had disappointed her that day. Arthur tells her that she doesn't need to be apologizing for them. She says that she felt it was necessary since they are friends. Arthur smiles and asks if they are friends. Kathleen says that she was told by her brother that sharing skinship is only done with friends. Arthur is startled to hear that. Kathleen thinks that she had grown up blaming her lineage, her magical prowess, and when her physical appearance for robbing her of her freedom. Yet, how can a boy so talented and sought after, so scrutinized and judged, be so bright? Kathleen laughs a little, and she quickly puts her hand on her mouth. Arthur asks if the literal ice princess just laugh. Kathleen turns her head and says his lesson was very interesting today, and she asks how the outcomes of the 2 wind bullet spells turned out so different. Arthur asks if that is why she came up to him, and if this was her true motive all along. Catherine says no, that was never her intention. Arthur gets up and says, relax, princess. He was only joking. He winks at her and says it'd be even more unfair if he gave his brightest student an advantage and leaves. Kathleen starts smiling. She looks down and sees that Sylvie is laughing at her. After some time, during Gideon's class, Emily asks Arthur if he got hurt on the first day of the class. Arthur replies that he is mostly fine now. Gideon is annoyed to hear them talk. He throws a chalk towards them and it hits Emily on her head. Gideon asks Emily to please enlighten the class as to the primary components of a basic light-producing artifact. Emily stands up and says the basic light-producing artifact is made up of the foundation crystal, Florentine, found abundantly near the outskirts of Sapin and also in the kingdom of Darv. After Florentine is refined, it will constantly let out a dim light in order to control the output of the ore. Gideon interrupts her and says okay, that's enough. He just asked for the material. After the class, Arthur and Emily are walking together. He feels a little pain in his shoulder and says that Geezer already assigned them a project. Emily tells Arthur that she already have a couple LPAS she made for fun. He can have one if he wants since he missed a few days of classes. Arthur is excited to hear that and says that she is a lifesaver. Emily tells him that they're just lying around in her dorm anyway. Sylvie tells Arthur to do his own work, and Elijah comes running and tells Arthur that Director Goodsky is calling for him. Arthur tells Elijah that she is Emily, and he introduces Elijah to Emily. They both shake hands and start smiling after saying that it is nice to meet each other. Elijah tells Arthur that Director Goodsky asked him to make sure he heads to the training room. Arthur says he got it and takes his leave. Arthur tells them to get acquainted and that he'll see them later. Arthur goes inside the training room and sees that Tess is sitting there and she's meditating. Sylvie jumps on Tess and calls her mama. Tess opens her eyes and starts caressing her. She waves at Arthur and he waves back at her. Arthur asks where's Director Goodsky. Tess replies, she said that something urgent came up and left not too long ago. Arthur thinks that he can bet she schemed this whole thing. Tess asks Arthur if they should get started. Arthur thinks that assimilation with any beast took a lot of effort, and most times couldn't be done alone, while oftentimes a mage of the same elemental affinity as the beast itself was needed to take some of the burden away from the host. He is a quadra-elemental mage, so using an even balance of all 4 elements, he was able to not only help assimilate Tesha with her beast will, but also act as a sort of refined mana battery, strengthening Tesha's body and help her fight against the Elderwood Guardian trying to establish control over her core. After some time, Arthur and Tess are both panting. He sits on the ground and says that they can call it a day, and Tess thanks him for helping her. They look at Sylvie playing with Tobai. Tess asks Arthur if he is mad that she kissed him, and Arthur says that he was surprised but never mad. Tess asks why he has been avoiding her ever since they kissed. Arthur starts smiling and says they are both so young, and he has known her since she was an immature little girl. He knows it's not weird for a girl her age to get married since she's royalty, but he doesn't have that background. Tess tells him that he is just making excuses now. They both know she didn't mean that they should get married, and she knows it was wrong of her to take advantage of him back then, but she just wants things to progress. Arthur starts smiling and says he thinks that they have processed a lot since 8 years ago. He tells her that she is not the same crybaby princess she was before. Tess is furious. She gets up and says that is enough. She tells Arthur that she didn't expect an answer from him, but she at least wanted him to take this seriously. Tess leaves and says that she is sorry she expected so much from him. Arthur tells her to wait. Tess opens the door and tells Arthur that he is so confident about so many things. Magic, fighting, wits, so confident in all of these things because he's good at them. But there are also things he's not good at. He doesn't think the people around him have noticed how he always puts on a mask and pretends that he is happy or unaffected by anything. Even now, his reaction is to try and make light of her feelings towards him and even tease her. Tess tells Arthur that, in any case, he's the one being immature, not her, just like the way he rejected Lilia. Arthur is shocked to hear that. Tess slams the door and leaves. Arthur wonders how she knew about that. He asks what she wants him to do. It is not like he can tell her about his past and how old he actually is. After a while, Arthur is training with Tobai, and he remembers what Tess said to him. Arthur is furious. He's about to punch Tobai, but Tobai shuts down due to low mana reserve. Arthur stops his punch from hitting Tobai. He sits down to catch his breath. Sylvie tells Arthur that he shouldn't push himself too much because he's still healing. Arthur pats her on the head and says he's fine. There's a knock at the door. Arthur opens the door and sees Professor Glory standing there. She tells Arthur that she came to check up on him since both he and Princess Tesha skipped out on her class. She peeks inside the room and asks what happened here. Arthur closes the door behind him and says that he was just doing some training and Tess isn't with him. The professor starts laughing and says that she guessed wrong then. She puts her arm around Arthur and tells him to come with her. He already missed her class and one more. Arthur starts walking with her. She wonders that a private training room accessible only to Arthur is one thing, but one that large and what sort of training causes a mana-reinforced room to look like that. She thinks that the more she sees this boy, the more mysterious he gets. Arthur arrives in the class. He looks sad, and everyone is gossiping about him that he never shows up in class. Arthur grabs Sylvie's face and asks how she sleeps so much. She replies that she's training, not sleeping. Arthur says that she is lucky. He wishes that he could get stronger by sleeping. The professor calls Arthur, and he raises his hand and says yes. The professor says that it is good to finally have him in his class, and he has heard that he is back after healing from the injury. Arthur says that he apologizes for missing so many of his classes, including Professor Maynor. Maynor says it is good, and he asks Arthur if he cares to share with the rest of the class what he knows about spell formations. Arthur stands up and says that, to his knowledge, spell formations are the conjoining or altering of basic spells and skills in order to produce a different effect. Maynor starts clapping and says very well put. He says that they spent most of last week reviewing aspects that one must know before even touching the foundation of spell formations. He starts walking towards the students and says that he would like everyone to imagine a world where everyone could read everyone's mind. The students start looking at each other in confusion. Maynor explains that in this hypothetical world, where fleeting thoughts that can make even the purest man seem perverse, or the kindest woman seem cruel, are laid out in the open for others to read, he believes that such a world would be home to the best mages ever known. Sylvie says that's why Papa and Sylvie are the best mages. Maynor asks why do some conjurers and even augmenters chant while some don't. A student raises his hand and says that he thought that if one has mastered a spell, then they don't have to chant. Maynor says it is right to an extent, But saying that he has mastered something is rather ambiguous, so no, they chant because words themselves influence their consciousness. He further adds that it fills the caster's mind with the correct suggestion that molds the mana into the desired spell. To give a rather humorous example, if he were to say to a woman who detests him that he has always loved her, they can bet there would be some sort of reaction from her. The incantation, which in this case is him saying he has always loved her, triggers the response, or the spell from her, which would take the form of either her cringing in disgust, kicking his shin, or perhaps slapping his face. Everyone starts laughing. Arthur thinks that he sure knows how to keep his students' attention. Maynard says much like that. Their thoughts influence their spells, allowing for shortened incantation or even no incantation when a high level of focus and visualization is achieved. That is why, if there ever was a world where everyone could read each other's minds, that world would have the greatest of magicians because they would have absolute control over their thoughts. Maynard tells everyone to turn their textbooks to page 23, where they can see some differences between augmenters and conjurers. After the class, Arthur walks into the hall. He wonders what's the use of going to class when all he can think about is his fight with Tess. He didn't think her words would bother him this much. Sylvie says it's because what Mama said was true. Arthur asks whose side she's on, and besides, there were plenty that hated him while he was an adventurer.